My father leaned toward the microphone in that courtroom, looked directly at me across 12 feet of empty air, and said, "You're wrong, my foolish daughter. You always have been." He said it loud enough for the entire gallery to hear, loud enough that my own attorney flinched beside me. What he didn't know, what nobody in that courtroom knew, except the one person sitting quietly at the clerk's table with a sealed manila folder in front of her, was that in about 90 seconds, the judge was going to unseal a military file that would make every word he'd just said collapse in front of him. I sat there in a gray blazer I'd bought specifically because it looked unthreatening, hands folded on the table exactly the way my attorney had coached me to sit, and I let him talk. I'd been letting him talk for 6 months by that point. I'd learned, the hard way, that arguing with my father in front of an audience only ever made him louder. But to understand why he was standing in a courtroom trying to take my own children away from me, calling me foolish in front of a judge, I need to take you back 14 months, to the night my husband died and the exact moment my father decided he knew better than I did what my life was supposed to look like now. My name is Major Sarah Kellerman, and before any of this, my life belonged almost entirely to two things, my job and my kids. I served as an intelligence officer, work that came with a level of classification I couldn't discuss at dinner parties, couldn't explain to my own father beyond the vaguest possible terms, and definitely couldn't use to defend myself in the exact way I desperately wanted to during this custody fight. My husband, Daniel, had been a Marine helicopter pilot, and we'd built our entire marriage around 2 overlapping deployment schedules, a spreadsheet of childcare logistics that would have impressed a management consultant, and a genuine, uncomplicated love for each other that made the chaos worth it. We met at a joint training exercise 11 years earlier, back when I was fresh out of my commissioning course and he was already 3 years into flying, and I remember him telling me, on our second date, that the thing he liked most about dating another service member was that he never had to explain why the job sometimes came first. It was a small thing to say out loud, but it meant more than almost anything else anyone had ever told me, because I'd spent my entire adult life bracing for the opposite reaction from the people closest to me. We had 2 kids, Owen, 10, quiet and watchful in the way kids get when they've spent their whole childhood adjusting to parents who disappear and reappear on a schedule they don't control, and Mia, 7, loud in every room she entered, utterly unbothered by any of it. Daniel and I had built a life that worked, even when it looked nothing like the lives our own parents had built. My father, Walter, had never once approved of it. Walter Kellerman had spent 30 years as a partner at a mid-sized accounting firm in Cincinnati, the kind of career built on predictability, punctuality, and an almost religious devotion to routine. He'd raised my sister and me on a strict schedule, dinner at 6, homework at 7, lights out at 9, and he'd never fully forgiven me for choosing a career that operated on none of those principles. "You picked a job that means your kids never know if you're coming home," he told me once, at a Thanksgiving dinner 3 years earlier, in front of both my children. I didn't have a good answer for that at the time. I'm not sure I have one now. I just know it wasn't true in the way he meant it. Daniel died in a training accident 14 months ago, a mechanical failure during a routine flight. The kind of accident that gets a 2-paragraph write-up in a base newspaper and then quietly disappears from public memory while the family left behind spends years unable to disappear from it at all. I remember almost nothing about the week after the notification officers came to my door. I remember Owen asking, 3 days in, if Dad was coming home for his birthday, and I remember not having an answer that didn't break both of us. I remember Mia, too young to fully understand permanence yet, asking almost weekly for months whether Daddy's plane had found its way home yet, and I remember rehearsing different versions of an honest answer in the shower each morning before I ever had to give her one out loud. My father flew in for the funeral. He stayed 11 days, sleeping on the pull-out couch in my living room, making coffee every morning before I woke up, doing the kind of quiet, practical helping that, at the time, genuinely felt like support. He drove Owen to school. He kept Mia occupied during the parts of each day I couldn't manage to be fully present for. I remember being grateful for him that week in a way I hadn't been in years. And somewhere in that same 11 days, watching me function on autopilot, running a household of 3 on grief and muscle memory, he decided, quietly, without telling me at the time, that I was not fit to raise my own children alone. The petition came 4 months later, filed in Hamilton County Family Court, requesting that my father be granted legal guardianship of Owen and Mia. His argument, laid out across 60 pages of legal filing, was built on a foundation I recognized immediately, because I'd heard versions of it at every holiday dinner for a decade. That my career made me fundamentally unreliable as a single parent, that my classified deployments meant unexplained absences a judge should treat as red flags, that a widow with a job she couldn't discuss in detail was, by definition, a liability to 2 grieving children who needed stability above everything else. I remember standing in my kitchen holding that filing, Mia's homework spread across the counter behind me, and feeling something in my chest go completely, dangerously still. Not panic. Something colder. I'd survived deployments where the wrong decision got people killed. I understood, on some fundamental level, that panic was a luxury I couldn't afford, not that week, not with my children's custody sitting on the table in front of me. I called my attorney, a sharp, unflappable woman named Renata Osei who'd handled military family cases for nearly 20 years, and read her the filing over the phone. She was quiet for a moment before she said, "This is going to come down to your service record, Sarah. And I need you to understand something up front, most of what would actually help us, you can't legally show me." She was right. My personnel file, the parts that mattered most, sat behind a classification level that even I couldn't casually discuss, let alone submit as courtroom evidence. My father had built an entire legal argument out of the exact silence my job required of me, and there was, on paper, almost nothing I could do to fill that silence in. That was the moment I understood exactly what I was up against. Not just my father's opinion of me, I'd lived with that my whole life. A legal system that, without proper authorization, couldn't see the difference between a mother who'd disappeared for selfish reasons and a mother who'd disappeared because her country asked her to, and legally couldn't tell her own children why. The first hearing, 3 months later, was smaller than I expected, a preliminary conference more than a real courtroom battle, but it gave me my first real look at exactly how my father intended to fight this. He'd hired a private investigator named Gregory Toonstra, a heavy-set man with a folder of surveillance photos he presented like they were smoking guns. Photos of me leaving the base at odd hours. Photos of Owen and Mia at their after-school program on days I was traveling. A timeline he'd built showing gaps in my presence that, out of context, looked exactly as damning as my father wanted them to look. Major Kellerman was absent for 11 days in March, Toonstra said, reading from his report, with no documented explanation available to this investigation. I sat there, unable to explain that those 11 days had been a classified operational briefing I couldn't discuss in a public courtroom without violating security clearances that existed for reasons entirely separate from my role as a mother. My attorney objected on procedural grounds, bought us time, but I left that first hearing with a hollow, furious feeling I didn't have anywhere safe to put. My sister, Beth, called me that night. Beth had always occupied the space between my father and me, sympathetic to both sides, careful never to fully choose one. "I don't think Dad's doing this to hurt you," she said, which was, I understood even then, the closest thing to taking a side she was capable of. "He's suing me for my children, Beth. He thinks he's protecting them." "He's wrong," I said, and my voice cracked in a way I hadn't expected it to. "He's wrong, and I can't even fully explain why, because explaining why is illegal." "I know that's not fair," Beth said. "I do. But you know how he is. He's spent his whole life needing to see the whole picture before he trusts anything. It's how he ran his practice for 30 years. Never signed off on a number he couldn't personally trace back to its source. I'm not a spreadsheet, Beth. I know, she said, quieter now. I don't think he does, not really. Not yet. Beth was quiet for a long moment. I believe you, she finally said. I've always believed you were a good mother, Sarah. I don't think that's ever been the real question for Dad. I think the real question, underneath all of this, is that he's never once trusted anything he couldn't fully see and control. And your job has never given him that. It wasn't the resolution I wanted. It was, at least, an honest one, and honest was in short supply that month. The false hope came 2 weeks before the final hearing, when Renata submitted a motion requesting judicial review of my classified personnel file under a narrow federal provision that allows sealed military records to be reviewed, though not disclosed, in custody proceedings involving national security-related employment. I let myself believe, for the better part of those 2 weeks, that the motion would simply resolve the entire case quietly, that a judge would review whatever was in that file and dismiss my father's petition without any of us needing to sit through a full hearing at all. It didn't work that way. The judge, a measured, careful woman named Judge Patricia Alvarez, granted the motion for review but ruled that the case would still proceed to a full hearing, with the file's contents disclosed, if at all, only at her discretion, during proceedings, if she determined it was relevant and necessary. I understand the sensitivity here, she told both attorneys in a private conference, but I have 2 children whose custody is being decided, and I intend to make that decision based on complete information, handled appropriately, not partial information built entirely around what one party is legally forbidden from explaining. I left that conference with something more complicated than relief. A door had opened. It hadn't guaranteed anything on the other side of it. The final hearing arrived on a gray Tuesday in October. I hadn't slept properly in 3 days. Owen and Mia were staying with Beth for the week, blissfully unaware of exactly how much of their future was being decided in a courtroom 11 miles away, and some small, protective part of me was grateful they'd never have to see any of what came next. My father took the stand first, at his attorney's request, laying out his case in the same steady, reasonable tone he'd used at every family dinner where he'd quietly undermined a decision I'd made without ever technically raising his voice. He described the surveillance photos. He described the unexplained absences. He described, in careful, damaging detail, a portrait of a mother too consumed by a secretive career to be present for the 2 children who needed her most. Then my attorney began her cross-examination, and I watched my father's composure hold for almost 10 full minutes before it started, almost imperceptibly, to crack. Mr. Kellerman, Renata said, you've testified that your daughter's absences were, quote, unexplained. Did you ever ask her directly what those absences involved? She wouldn't have told me, he said. She's never been able to tell me anything about her job. Did you ask her whether that inability to explain might be a function of federal law, rather than a personal failing? He hesitated. I asked her to make different choices. To choose her family over a job that keeps secrets from the people who love her. Isn't it true, Mr. Kellerman, that you've disapproved of your daughter's military career since before she commissioned? Long before this custody dispute began? His jaw tightened. I've disapproved of the instability. The unpredictability. Any parent would. Is it instability, Mr. Kellerman, Renata said, quieter now, or is it simply something you were never invited fully into? Something you couldn't control? That's a lot of psychology for a courtroom, he said, an attempt at deflection that landed flat in the silence that followed it. It's a question, Mr. Kellerman. You're welcome to answer it or not. He didn't have an answer for that either way. And that was when, unable to hold his composure any longer, he turned in the witness stand, looked directly at me across the courtroom, and said the sentence that would define this entire hearing. You're wrong, my foolish daughter. You always have been. You chose a career you couldn't explain over children who needed to know their mother would actually be there. And I am not going to sit here and let 2 more children pay for that decision the way you did." The gallery went completely silent. My attorney's hand found my forearm under the table, a small, steadying pressure that kept me from responding the way every instinct in my body wanted to. I sat there, hands folded exactly as I'd been coached, and I let him finish, though something in his voice, cracking slightly on the last sentence, told me even he wasn't entirely sure anymore whether he believed every word of it. Judge Alvarez let the silence sit for a long moment before she spoke. "Mr. Kellerman," she said, "I'd like to remind you that this is a courtroom, not a family dinner table. You'll address the court, not the respondent directly." She turned a page in front of her, and something in the deliberate calm of that gesture made the entire room go still in a different way. "I've reviewed the sealed portions of Major Kellerman's personnel file under the provision granted in the earlier motion. I've determined that certain elements of that file are directly relevant to the claims made in this proceeding, and I'm going to disclose a summary of them now, in appropriately redacted form, for the record." She opened the folder the clerk had been holding all morning. Major Kellerman's file confirms that the absences documented by Mr. Toonstra's investigation correspond to 3 classified operational deployments over the past 4 years, each formally authorized, each conducted under Department of Defense oversight. She looked up briefly. 2 of those deployments resulted in official commendations. One resulted in the Bronze Star, awarded for actions directly contributing to the safe extraction of a covert unit under hostile conditions. I heard my father's breath catch audibly from the witness stand. "I want to be clear," Judge Alvarez continued, "that I am not disclosing this information to render a moral judgment on military service versus civilian parenting. I'm disclosing it because Mr. Kellerman's entire petition is built on the premise that these absences were unexplained, unauthorized, and indicative of poor judgment. The record does not support that premise. It supports, if anything, the opposite conclusion." My father sat frozen in the witness stand, the same posture he'd held through his entire testimony, except now it looked less like composure and more like a man who genuinely didn't know what to do with his hands. Furthermore, the judge added, "The investigation submitted by the petitioner appears to have drawn conclusions from surveillance conducted without full information, presenting absences it characterized as suspicious that were, in fact, lawful, authorized, and in 2 instances, directly connected to actions that saved lives." She closed the folder. "I would ask petitioner's counsel to consider, going forward, whether continuing to characterize those absences as evidence of parental unfitness is a position this court can reasonably entertain." The fallout in that courtroom happened in real time, in a way I don't think anyone, including me, was fully prepared for. My father's attorney requested a brief recess, presumably to regroup, but my father didn't wait for it. He stood up from the witness stand, still visibly shaken, and for the first time since the hearing began, looked at me not with the sneering certainty he'd carried in for months, but with something closer to confusion. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, quiet enough that only the front rows could hear it. "I couldn't," I said. "That's the entire point, Dad. I legally couldn't. And you decided that meant something terrible about me instead of asking whether it might mean something else." He didn't have an answer for that either. Beth, sitting 2 rows behind me, later told me she watched something in my father's face fully collapse in that moment, not into anger, but into something quieter and considerably harder to watch, a man realizing, in front of a judge in a room full of strangers, that he'd spent 6 months building a legal case on an assumption he'd simply never bothered to question. The judge dismissed the guardianship petition in full an hour later. My father's attorney didn't contest it further. There wasn't much left to contest. I didn't feel triumphant walking out of that courthouse. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect the ending of a story like this to feel like a victory lap, and it didn't, not entirely. I felt exhausted, mostly, and something else underneath the exhaustion I didn't have a name for yet. A kind of grief for the version of this relationship with my father that might have existed if he'd simply asked me a question instead of hiring an investigator to answer it for him. Beth picked up the kids from her house that evening and brought them to mine, and I remember sitting on the kitchen floor with Owen and Mia for almost 20 minutes before either of them noticed I was still in my court clothes, still hadn't changed, still hadn't fully exhaled since that gray Tuesday morning. Mia climbed into my lap without asking why, the way 7-year-olds do when they sense something without needing it explained. Owen, older, quieter, just sat close enough that our shoulders touched. "Is everything okay now?" he asked eventually. "Everything's okay," I told him, and for the first time in months, I actually believed the sentence as I said it. It's been 7 months since that hearing. My father and I have spoken exactly 4 times since, each conversation shorter and more careful than the last. He apologized once, in a phone call I didn't expect, in a voice that sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I should have asked you," he said. "I spent 30 years building a career on knowing every number before I made a decision, and I didn't extend you the same courtesy. I'm sorry, Sarah." I told him I appreciated hearing that. I didn't tell him it fixed anything, because it didn't, not fully, not yet. Some kinds of trust take longer to rebuild than a single apology can manage, no matter how sincere it is. Beth tells me he's different now, in small ways, quieter at family gatherings, slower to offer an opinion before he's asked one. I don't know if that's growth or just the exhaustion of a man who badly miscalculated something he was certain about for 30 years. Maybe it doesn't matter which one it is, as long as the questions keep coming instead of the assumptions. Owen and Mia don't know most of what happened in that courtroom, and I don't intend to tell them the full version until they're old enough to understand what it actually meant. What they do know is that their grandfather visits less often now, and that when he does, he asks me questions instead of making assumptions, small ones, at first, about my schedule, about deployments, about things he'd have simply decided he already knew the answer to a year earlier. It isn't everything. It's more than I expected. 6 months ago, sitting at that kitchen table reading a custody filing that treated my entire career as evidence against me. I don't know how to tell you this story ends with my father fully understanding what my job costs me, or fully making peace with a life he never chose for me and never fully approved of. It doesn't. Some wounds don't close just because the truth finally gets a hearing. What I know instead is that my children still have a mother who comes home, in whatever form that homecoming takes, and a service record that finally, if only in a Hamilton County courtroom on one gray Tuesday, spoke for itself. Some people will spend their whole lives deciding what your silence means before they ever think to ask you directly. I've stopped waiting for all of them to ask. I've started trusting, instead, that the truth doesn't actually need my father's permission to be true.